doesn't feel that there's a leech biting into it. And secondly, the parasite actually has to take over the host's brain to convince it that it's part of the sector. And what happens in America is that the fire sector and the banks are trying to convince voters and the people that saving the banks is actually part of saving the economy, instead of just the opposite. It's saving the parasite that is draining the purchasing power out of the economy, essentially to transfer wealth upward, to take wealth from the bottom 99% and transfer it upwards to the upper 1% of the population, which basically is what controls the property and finance sector.
I'm speaking with financial economist and historian Dr. Michael Hudson. Today's show, The Way We Were and What We Are Becoming. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. It also sounds like maybe the media plays a major role in this parasite.
Well, hardly surprising that the fire sector has tried to buy up most of the media. And, for instance, General Electric owns NBC, and I'm watching CNBC now, and General Electric has been turned largely into a financial company, which is why its stock is collapsing more than almost any other stock on the exchange today. So you've had the financialized companies turn into the big media companies, and you can hardly expect them to become information companies telling people. In fact, the idea of the free market is pushed by neoliberals, is that instead of people having full knowledge of the market, people have to have no understanding of how the market works at all. They have to be utterly confused about the economy in order to accept the neoliberal crap that is being pushed on them now by CNBC and by others that are trying to blame the poor for the problems, blame you had Rick Santelli come on CNBC today to say it's really awful that the Americans are giving money to these liars who bought the property by misrepresenting their income. Now, everyone really knows, everyone in Europe, everyone in Asia knows that the so-called liars' loans, the liars are the banks. When somebody would go to borrow a $300,000 mortgage to buy a house, the loan officer would sit and say, okay, to get this mortgage, you have to say you have X amount of income. We'll write that down there. The forms were not filled out by the mortgage applicant. They were filled out by the loan officers. It's the banks who are the liars, and we're dealing with the largest financial fraud in American history, and the government is now saying, in order to save the economy, you have to make the fraudsters whole, and it's legitimizing the crime. The criminals have taken over the economy, certainly the Treasury, and the key economic control points, and the public media. And at a certain point, people are going to realize they've been lied to, and that's when you're going to have the political explosion.
Now, you just mentioned the term free markets. Now, I noticed that you wrote an article called Orwellian Doublethink, Nationalize the Banks, Free Markets. What about the term free markets?
Well, the question is free for whom? The free markets today are supposed to refer to what Adam Smith and the classical economists wrote about. When they talked about free markets, they meant a market free of unearned income. A free market was where people would earn what they produced, and that meant the number one aim of classical economics was to tax the free lunch, to tax land rent and interest. And the idea was to have an economy that had minimum property rent or interest that wasn't taxed. The idea was to shift the tax base off labor onto the landlord class and onto the financial class. That's what Adam Smith wrote. It's what John Stuart Mill wrote. That was the ideal. In order to make an economy more competitive, you had to bring market prices in line with the actual cost of production that ultimately could be reduced to the cost of hiring labor, including the labor that made the machinery, labor that made the raw materials. The cost basically of most products was reducible to labor. And the idea was to minimize the rake-off of the fire sector. Today, a free market means free for the fire sector, for the banks, and for the real estate sector, any insurance companies like AIG, to essentially loot the economy, to impose toll booths everywhere that it can, toll booths for credit, toll booths for rent, toll booths for public utilities, and to maximize the ratio of interest and economic rent and monopoly pricing relative to overall pricing, leaving less and less for actual costs of production, so that instead of having an economy whose costs reflect what's technologically necessary for production, you have an economy where as much as possible goes for the parasite, for the finance, insurance, and real estate sector.
You have written that Marxists believed that a revolution was necessary to reclaim property rent for the public domain and to enable governments to create their own credit rather than borrow at interest from commercial bankers and wealthy bondholders. You went on to say that the aim was not to create a bureaucracy, but to free society from the surviving absentee ownership power of the vested property and financial interests. And I guess that's just what you've been describing.
Well, the point that you didn't read what I'd written just before that, and the point was made also at this weekend's Eastern Economic Association meeting. Ingrid Rima gave a paper on how Marx was the last classical economist. Marxism aimed at exactly the same objective that Adam Smith aimed for, John Stuart Mill aimed for, in the sense of purifying the economy, of freeing it from the rentiers, from property. But as Adam Smith and Mill thought that this could be done peacefully, Marx said that as a result of the 1848 revolutions, this showed that the bourgeoisie in Europe was not willing to take the final step of really freeing the economy, and in fact, over and above the problems of the carryovers from feudalism, an extractive banking system, and real estate, you had an exploitative industrial system that pitted capital against labor. So Marx said that the ideal of classical economics couldn't be done peacefully. He thought it could only be done by labor organizing to promote its own economic interest. And he was very much against state power, and both he and Engels went out of their way to say socialism is not a large state. Feudalism was a large state. Dictatorship is a large state. Stalinism was a large state. Fascism is a large state. None of these are socialist in the slightest. His idea was of socialism entailed what he called a withering away of the state, just exactly the opposite of a socialist bureaucracy.
Well, then, if Karl Marx was saying that the rentier type economy was not going to go away, that it had to be thrown out, is it beginning to look like he was right?
That would seem to be the case. I'm not sure whether there will be a violent revolution. The fact is that it is the recipients of unearned income that have always been violent. It's the rich that have been violent, not the poor. And that's because the rich are defending their free lunch, and people are willing to fight for their free lunch, to kill. It was the Pinochet regime that ended up the most murderous regime in Latin America with Operation Condor. It wasn't the communists' regime or the left-wing regimes in the Third World. It's always been the rich that have resorted to violence, not the masses. So the danger is that most violent revolutions are from the right, not from the left. That wasn't something that socialists a century ago confronted.
Well, now, do you think that that is a real danger then today as this economy continues to deteriorate and Obama and his economic team keep throwing money at the banks and it doesn't work? At some point, as you've mentioned, there's got to be some sort of a political upheaval. What do you think the likelihood is that there would actually be a revolution from the right?
Well, we're seeing something like that in the post-Soviet Union. And in fact, if you want to see the plan that the neoliberals have for the United States, look at their dress rehearsal, not only in Chile, but in Russia after 1991, and especially after 1996, when Mr. Obama's current advisors, the Treasury Secretary, Summers, and Geithner had a free hand in Russia. You had basically a right-wing revolution there, and in the last week in the post-Soviet economies, you've had revolutions in the streets from Latvia to the Ukraine. You already have a political crisis there that's bringing down the neoliberal governments. And now in today's Wall Street Journal, for instance, you have the Journal virtually insisting that the U.S. and that Europe are willing to go to war with Russia over the Ukraine to prevent the Ukrainians deciding that they want to rejoin the Soviet Union now that Europe has bankrupted them. All throughout the post-Soviet economies, throughout Central Europe, they realize that they've been tricked. They've been lied to, that they believed that what they were being told was how Europe and North America were going to help their economies industrialize in the same way that Europe and America industrialized, by protecting their industry and by building up their manufacturing power and productive capacity. Instead, Europe especially, but also America, looked at these economies as victims to be looted, to be emptied out, and instead of rebuilding their industry, they tore down the factories, sold them for junk, and essentially set up foreign bank loans to lend in foreign currency to inflate their real estate prices and create a real estate bubble that took place without any domestic industrialization. Not only did they essentially steal the public domain through the kleptocrats selling hotels, natural resources to Western investors, but also these economies lost maybe 10% of their adult labor force between the ages of 25 and 35 to immigration, so that you had Latvian immigrants, Polish immigrants going to Ireland, going to England. Essentially, you had not only a brain drain, but also a drain of skilled labor from these countries to Europe. Well, now, all of a sudden, now that the Irish bubble and the British bubble are bursting, you're having the Latvians go back where they came from, and the Poles go back to where they came from, back to the farms where they're only able to support themselves in subsistence agriculture, so that the neoliberal alternative to Stalinist bureaucracy was neo-feudalism, subsistence production on the land. And when these people are now coming back, they say, we were lied to by the neoliberals. Europe has only been trying to exploit us. We want to now realign ourselves with Russia. You're having that in the eastern Ukraine especially, which is largely Russian-oriented. And you're having the Wall Street Journal say it's time for America to essentially go to war against Russia and Ukraine, but let's let our European proxies do that. You can't lose Ukraine to Russia. And so you're certainly having a showdown there. The government is in the process of collapsing. Nobody knows what's going to happen there. But it's like a grab bag, and essentially this has been not only a lost decade for the post-Soviet economies, but it's a decade that has left them very deeply in debt. The currency is plunging, and ironically, there's a blowback to Europe, because the Austrian banks, for instance, are threatened with bankruptcy by having lent real estate loans to the Hungarians that are now defaulting, just as they lost in the Kreditanstalt collapse in 1932 that helped trigger the Great Depression, just as the Rothschilds lost loans from Austria to Hungary in the 19th century. Meanwhile, the Swedish banks are faced with insolvency because they've made so many loans to the Baltics that are defaulting that they're endangered. Well, the European response is, let's give money to the Baltic countries, but now the Baltic countries are realizing that this is all a lie, that every single dollar, every single euro, and every Swiss franc that has been given nominally to the Baltic states has been given to them to repay the Swedish banks. Not a penny has been left in the Baltic states, and in fact, they say, we're giving you $10 billion, or 10 billion euros, to repay the Swedish banks, but now to pay us, you have to cut back your budgets, you have to lower your wage rates. Unfortunately, you're only taxing your labor a flat tax of 62% in Latvia. You have to tax labor more. You have to reduce living standards more. You have to squeeze the economy even more to pay the Swedish banks because we're here to screw you. Now, you can imagine why there are riots in Riga. You can imagine why the prime minister was thrown out of office. The prime minister that was trained in Georgetown University is the very first prime minister. The prime minister trained by American liberals, sent to Latvia to rip off the economy. That is essentially what's happening, and you're having all of Central Europe be